The $12 trillion Chokepoint, why China controls the future of all technology. The magnets arrived late and out of spec. A jet sat grounded while a factory supervisor stared at a shipment he couldn't use. Somewhere far away, a tailings pond steamed under grey sky. The phone calls started. Where are parts? The answer traced to one map nobody voted on. Get this, rare earths aren't rare. The lever is who refinishes them to purity. And that geography sits behind guarded gates in a few Chinese cities. The lie, the trap, the consequence will show all three. Who engineered this choke point, and why did everyone let it happen? To see it, follow the pipes into one cluster. The anatomy of a lie, the industrial moat. Start with the deception hiding in plain sight. Geology never gave China a monopoly on rare earths. Abundance is scattered from California to Western Australia to Inner Asia. The bottleneck formed later, at the plant where concentrates are turned into oxides, metals, alloys, and finally, magnets with specs that break most budgets. The map that matters is a refining map, not a mining map. That's the lie. People heard rare and imagined scarcity in the ground. The scarcity is in process capacity you can trust. To understand the moat, pin the places. Baotou in Inner Mongolia, anchored by a steelworks that feeds and funds the chemistry next door. Ganzhou in Jiangxi, the historic heart for iron adsorption clays and heavy rare earth separation. Add a handful of zones strung along rivers with water and power, clusters that grew step by step into a midstream empire. Financialized geography tied a $12 trillion tech stack, EVs, wind, smartphones, medical scanners, radar, to those gates. Contracts, credit, and quiet guarantees routed through these addresses until alternatives felt risky. Inside the machine, chemistry turns into choreography. Solvent extraction in long banks of mixacetylers, sometimes 100 stages, moves lanthanides by tiny differences in preference. pH control to the second decimal. Trace impurities that ruin coercivity later must be purged now, or the magnet fails hot. Miss the cut, and downstream yields collapse. People imagine beakers, think pipes, tanks, and operators who can hear a column drifting by the sound of a pump. Here's the dirty secret that made the moat wide. This separation throws off waste, salty, acidic, sometimes radioactive from thorium and uranium traces, plus a heavy water burden. If you price every liter of effluent and every cubic meter of tailings at Western standards, your spreadsheet screams stop. If you cluster the plants where local governments absorb the externalities, your competitors go broke trying to match your price. That's the economics. The waste bill that didn't show up on the invoice, exported as cost advantage. Then leverage arrived dressed as policy. Export quotas and license regimes in the 200s, and again in different forms later, signaled to buyers that compliance lived in one direction. Tariffs and value-added tax rebates nudged raw materials out and higher-value products in. When prices were flooded low, competitors shuttered. When prices spiked, customers came back anyway because nothing else could hit spec at volume. The cost curve bent to the will of the licensing office. Stakes sound abstract until you get precise. Displays need europium and terbium phosphors that won't flicker off hue. MRI gradients ask for fields that don't drift under heat. Defense systems ride on grams of neodymium iron boron magnets, with dysprosium or terbium sprinkled to hold coercivity in hot engines. Miss those purity specs by a hair, and a guidance system jitters, an actuator stalls, or a turbine runs loud and weak. Purity failure equals system failure. That's why buyers sign multi-year offtakes with plants they can visit, not mines with glossy decks. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the ocean. A mine like Mountain Pass could dig and crack ore, but its concentrates left home to return to China for finishing. Australia's leaners fought to keep separation steps alive outside the mainland, shipping to Malaysia and building toward new lines. But the intermediate choke, the midstream, kept dragging material back to the incumbents who knew the dance and owned the waste. Logistics math reinforced it. A long ship ride is cheaper than a short delay on a production line. Incumbents sold reliability as much as commodities. What nobody knew at the time, because tacit know-how hides in hands and habits, was how much repetition mattered. Thousands of cycles build craft memory you can't PDF. Operators logged failure budgets into muscle memory, how a column behaves in a cold snap, what a trace of iron does to praseodymium cut, when to swap organophosphorus extractants before they foul. You can buy equipment. You inherit experience only by standing in the steam for years. This was the moment everything changed for finance. Midstream margins looked thin, environmental liabilities looked thick, regulatory risk screamed red, capital fled to upstream headlines and downstream brands, leaving the messy center to whoever would take it. Beijing took it. Then, after consolidation, state-owned champions disciplined supply with quotas and kept rivals guessing with approvals that arrived on time, until they didn't. Proof of leverage came in shocks. A diplomatic crisis, a customs slowdown, a new control list on export of magnet production technologies rather than magnets themselves. Buyers panicked, hoarded, and promised diversification. The map barely moved. The message was quiet but clear. The refinery of last resort becomes the only resort if you let the others wither. Numbers still feel distant until you stand downwind. In Baotou, a black lake sprawls at the edge of the city, the tailings pond fed by the upstream complex. Residents learn to plan laundry days around the wind. The pond isn't the whole story, and China has tightened standards in phases, but the baseline bargain was simple: accept the burden locally to capture the value globally. The world got cheaper magnets and brighter screens. A few districts got the bill. That's the anatomy of the lie and the moat it built. Not geology, but geography plus policy plus waste economics plus tacit skill. If you want out, you don't just open a mine. You rebuild an ecosystem, and you pay the bill that was hidden in the price. The behavioral betrayal, why we walked away. To understand how the gates narrowed, follow the choices we made when nobody was watching. In the late 198s through the 200s, regulations tightened in the West. Effluent limits rose, waste handling got expensive, and environmental liabilities stopped being footnotes. Margins in the midstream, cracking, leaching, separation, were razor thin. Boardrooms asked a simple question: why carry the dirtiest inventory on our balance sheet when someone overseas will? Outsourcing wasn't a scandal, it was a shrug wrapped in a spreadsheet. Market flooding finished the job. When prices dropped below Western operating costs, plants paused temporarily. Temporary became permanent. A refinery closes, a lab disperses, a technician retires, and the know-how leaves with them. The mine-to-metal chain doesn't forgive gaps. Upstream shipments can sit. Midstream processes can't. If a column stops, the learning curve resets. Competitors in China didn't just keep running, they ran bigger and faster. When prices rose again, Western buyers returned to the same addresses, because those were the only ones that still hit spec at volume. Policy added scaffolding where capital wouldn't. Export incentives and tax breaks in key Chinese provinces met a forgiving approach to environmental compliance. Not lawless, disciplined enough to scale, flexible enough to win, paired with industrial clustering that put reagents, maintenance crews, and logistics next door. Meanwhile, Western projects faced permits that took years, litigation that pushed timelines, and investors who wanted out before the first pump spun. The outcomes weren't mysterious, they were scheduled. The finance trap looked rational at the time. Regulatory risk in the midstream was uninsurable compared to the glamour of upstream reserves or the margin of downstream devices. Bankers priced uncertainty with a penalty. Offtakes demanded minimum volume at exacting purity, but the first years of any new plant are sloppy. That mismatched strict contracts versus learning curve reality made projects unbankable. Capital chased certainty. Certainty lived where the columns already ran. Collective psychology sealed it. Quarterly guidance beat national strategy. Procurement teams got rewarded for shaving cents, not for de-risking a decade. An OEM buyer could swap suppliers on price and still meet this quarter's build until everybody swapped to the same supplier cluster. The individual optimization felt smart. The system-level fragility grew in silence. We optimized the invoice and ignored the map. Yet this talent flowed where failure was affordable. In China's clusters, running thousands of cycles built muscle memory. Failure budgets were real, time, feedstock, and patience to tune processes until they behaved. In the West, one slip meant a consent decree or a shareholder letter. Engineers trained on pilot rigs, not live banks of mixer-settlers that burped at 2 a.m. under that pressure gradient. Tacit knowledge migrated, one career move at a time. While that was happening in Guangzhou and Ganju, local politics in Nevada, California, Western Australia, and Quebec turned cautious. Communities asked fairly who pays for the tailings, the water draw, the truck traffic. Projects answered with binders and consultants. Meetings stretched into seasons. Investors counted carrying costs. Rivals kept shipping. No villain here, just timelines that didn't match a commodity cycle that punishes hesitation. Then came the price wars that emptied benches. Western refiners shuttered after being undercut for years. The equipment auctioned. The tech talent drifted into pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, or battery startups. When a government grant appeared to reboot a line, nobody could find the crew that knew how to keep an extraction column from fouling on day 17. The know-how had calcified elsewhere. Meanwhile, policy in Beijing tightened in a different way. Consolidations turned a patchwork of miners and processors into state-guided entities with quota discipline. Licensing managed who could export what and when. Value-added tax rebates favored moving up the stack, from oxides to metals to magnets. Each rung captured more margin and more leverage. Western procurement managers kept negotiating the oxide price. Their competitors were negotiating the magnet. Here's where the betrayal feels personal. A factory planner in Ohio hit a cost target by switching to the cheapest magnet vendor. He met his KPI. Across the ocean, a township swallowed another wastewater outfall. A decade later, the planner's line shut for 6 weeks when shipments slowed. His successors stared at a chart he didn't create and a choice he didn't have. What nobody priced correctly was misaligned clocks. Environmental damage compounds slowly, supply shocks arrive fast. Boards lived on 90-day windows. Refineries live on 5-year curves. A permit fought this spring means a shortage 2 winters from now when a wind project needs nacelles and the magnet plant says, Q extends to Q3. We didn't ignore the risk. We discounted it because it didn't land inside a fiscal year. 3 quiet mechanisms made walking away easy. First, contract structures that favored spot buys over take-or-pay commitments starved new plants of bankable revenue. Second, accounting that separated ESG reports from procurement decisions let people be green in one PDF and ruthless at the loading dock. Third, legal risk asymmetry. Sue a Western plant and you might win. Sue overseas and you might lose the market. Pushed activism into one jurisdiction and production into another. A micro story, a European display maker bragged about conflict-free sourcing while its phosphor supply rode a license issued in a province with lax enforcement. When the province cleaned up, output dipped, prices spiked, and the display maker blamed market volatility. It wasn't volatility, it was reality priced later. In the aftermath of the 201 scare, governments promised diversification. Reports were written, some money moved, but the behavioral groove was deep. Spot prices drifted back down, buyers exhaled, projects slipped a quarter, then a year. The map barely shifted. We didn't forget the lesson, we moved it to page 4. Call it a betrayal if you want. It felt like prudence at the time, but prudence piled up into dependence. And dependence, once built, collects interest. The bill came due the day shipments slowed and a jet sat cold on the tarmac, waiting for a magnet that only a handful of plants could make exactly right on time. Human stakes lives at the Chokepoint. The family's apartment faced the water, but nobody called it a lake. On hot days, a sour tang drifted in, and Mr. Lee taped towels along the window frames to keep the smell out of the children's room. His wife boiled tea and rinsed vegetables twice. Their daughter asked why her white socks turned gray on the balcony rail. He shrugged and said the wind was busy again. 2 bus rides away, a separation plant's pipes rattled through the night, mixer settlers surfing a narrow pH band, sending a trickle of perfection downstream and a flood of leftovers to the pond. Stakes aren't theoretical in a place like this. If he leaves, he loses the grandparents' clinic and the school they trust. If he stays, there are days the tap runs yellow. He's not a villain in a global story. He's a forklift operator who learned the rhythm of night shifts and overtime. He knows the magnet plant across town pays better because their deliveries can't slip, and he thinks about applying. He also knows 3 neighbors who cough through winter. The choice isn't between clean and dirty. It's between this paycheck and a distant promise that hasn't arrived. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away in Shenzhen, a factory floor waits. A line supervisor named Sue has 26 workers idled because the magnet trays are light by 2 cartons. The shipment passed customs, it failed the Gauss meter, off by just enough to throw a motor out of tolerance. He calls the supplier, checks the warehouse, then walks the floor doing quiet math. Every hour the line sits, wages burn, delivery windows shrink, and penalties stack. He has a list of substitutions, ferrite motors with performance hits, but the client's spec doesn't allow it. One bad batch upstream becomes an expensive silence downstream. What nobody sees in that silence is the cascade into kitchens. A woman in Ohio clocks out early because her plant can't assemble the final units and her paycheck dips. A repair shop in Manila keeps a broken MRI for another week, rebooking patients to the city hospital. A defense contractor pushes a test because an actuator lot missed coercivity, forcing retuning. Tiny parts, grams really, create outsized ripples. When people say supply chain, they mean someone's rent, someone's medicine, someone's deadline. Consumers notice too, just not with a headline. A phone ships with a quieter haptic motor. A laptop fan runs rougher at full load. An EV model year slips a quarter. The public explanation leans on logistics disruptions. The engineering note says the magnet grade changed, and redesigning the mount takes time. Prices budge in odd places, extended warranties, pro tiers that used to be standard, quiet taxes for a chokepoint nobody voted for. The military reads those ripples with a stopwatch. A squadron maintenance chief logs a backlog code, awaiting parts. Guidance fins need micromotors that hold torque at high temperature. A radar array wants alignment servos that don't drift under duty cycles. The stockroom clerk counts down a shelf that used to turn on 30 days and now turns on 90. No one panics. They reschedule sorties and cannibalize airframes to keep readiness numbers honest. But readiness has a texture, and this one's getting thinner. A pilot feels it as a delay that stretches training. A machinist at a subcontractor feels it as overtime on rework because a new magnet supplier needs different fixtures. A young engineer feels it as a weekend chasing a thermal issue that didn't exist before the substitution. The stakes aren't abstract doctrine. They're grams of material dictating whether a ship sails with everything working or with a note taped to a console, degraded mode until parts arrive. There's a ledger in all this, moral as much as financial. Toxicity exported so that phones stayed cheap and cars accelerated smoothly. Communities far from the end users absorbed the waste so that spreadsheets in clean offices smiled. When the bill shows up as a cough, as a fish kill after a sudden release, as a village well that tastes like metal, it doesn't arrive with a line item labeled subsidy. It arrives as a choice between moving and staying, paying and praying, speaking and keeping your job. Now zoom in on a moment that feels small and isn't. A magnet crate lands in a Midwestern motor plant. The receiving tech opens it, checks labels and frowns. The certificates look fine. The test bench says otherwise. He flags quality. The plant manager has two options: run and hope the motors survive warranty, or halt and eat the delay. He halts. The client screams. Days later, the supplier blames upstream yield noise. The manager walks to the break room, stares at a bulletin board with weekend shifts circled, and quietly tears one down. People go home early without pay. That magnet failed twice. Meanwhile in Baotou, Mr. Lee's daughter is studying verbs. A breeze lifts the curtain and he closes the window on reflex. He knows the plant is cleaner than it was when he started. New scrubbers, tighter dumping rules, inspections that matter. He also knows the pond isn't going away tomorrow. He holds both truths because both are true. When the wind softens, he opens the window and lets his daughter breathe. He tells her she should learn English. She asks why. He says it opens maps. None of this was an accident. The map was drawn over decades. The human lines drawn over it are fresh pencil marks, erased and redrawn with every shipment that clears, every crate that fails, every policy that tightens, every plan that slips. Lives stack along a choke point the world pretended was just a price curve. It's not. It's breath, paychecks, and the hum of machines that don't care about speeches, only on-spec parts on time. Origin story: building the choke point. To understand how a few industrial districts came to hold everyone's schedules, go back to a simple bet made in the 198s. Scale first, clean later, cluster everything in the middle. Deng-era planners looked at messy midstream chemistry and saw a ladder. If China owned the steps between ore and end use, the world would bring its upstream and its orders. So they drew circles on a map where power, water, labor, and rail met steel and chemicals. Mines could be far. Separation, metals, alloys, and magnets would sit elbow to elbow. The logic was blunt and effective. Flood, conquer, absorb. First, price undercutting. Push oxides and metals out at numbers Western plants couldn't match, helped by looser waste economics and provincial support. Second, buyouts and joint ventures. When rivals stumbled, acquire distressed gear, hire their engineers, copy what worked, and iterate. Third, knowledge capture. Make room for repetition, because tacit know-how accumulates at the shift level. Then teach the factories across town to use the output on fast cycles, closing the loop. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside those clusters. Failure budgets were real line items. Plants scheduled time to miss cuts, tweak pH ladders, swap extractants, and rerun fractions without losing contracts. Small wins compounded. Operators learned how iron adsorption clays from southern hills behaved differently than bastnasite from the north. Metallurgists turned on-spec metal into repeatable alloy recipes. Magnet shops refined pressing and sintering until coercivity at heat looked boring. The dividend wasn't a patent, it was a body of habits that made purity reliable. Governance hardened the edge. Through the 200s, Beijing consolidated a noisy field into fewer state-guided champions. Quotas disciplined exports. Licensing throttled who could sell what and when. Value-added tax rebates and credit lines pushed companies up the stack. Oxides to metals, metals to alloys, alloys to finished magnets and components. The state didn't run the pumps, it set the corridor walls. Private firms ran fast inside them. When margins thinned, mergers removed redundancies. When prices spiked, approvals slowed. Price signals met administrative signals and marched together. Here's the signal that echoed outward. China would be the refinery of last resort, and if rivals quit, the only one. The message wasn't shouted. It arrived in on-time shipments and quiet visits to plants that hit spec across seasons. From Tokyo to Munich to Dallas, procurement teams flew in, toured lines, met managers who could quote yields without looking at notes, and signed multi-year offtakes. Competitors elsewhere talked about pilot plants. The clusters shipped truckloads. Micro story: a Japanese magnet maker brought a scrap bin of failed parts to a Ganju shop in the late 199s. The Chinese engineers weighed each, tested microstructure, adjusted sintering profiles, and delivered a run that met the customer's worst-case thermal spec. The customer left the bin as a teaching aid. It stayed under a workbench for years, a reminder that failure belonged on the floor, not in a memo. The leverage test arrived in 201. A maritime dispute flared between China and Japan. Customs checks slowed. Export quotas tightened. Prices for oxides and metals jolted. Hoarding began. Substitution chatter filled boardrooms. Governments filed complaints at the WTO. Diversification pledges hit headlines. Then, as tempers cooled, shipments resumed at prices that reflected the new pecking order. The lesson burned in: chokepoints weren't theoretical. They were addresses, and everyone had the same address book. What nobody abroad fully saw was how the domestic map kept evolving. Environmental standards tightened in phases, with crackdowns that shut the dirtiest operations and pushed consolidation further. Illegal mining in southern clay hills got raids and fences. Big ponds gained liners, monitors, and PR tour. The baseline bargain remained: local burden for global leverage, but the presentation changed. Meanwhile, investment ran uphill into magnets, motor components, and systems. If you hold separation, moving into end-use isn't a leap, it's a commute. Policy kept writing the next chapter. Bans on exporting specific technologies, think grain boundary diffusion for dysprosium-light NdFeB sintered magnets, or advanced strip casting and hydrogen decrepitation process details, made it harder for newcomers to buy their way into competence. You could order a press. You couldn't order the calibration culture that made every batch boring. Training programs turned shop floor tricks into handbooks, and universities fed fresh chemists into solvent extraction halls that needed ears as much as eyes. Unknown to many Western investors, domestic demand swallowed more each year. EVs, appliances, industrial motors, wind turbines, drones, China's own factories pulled on the same midstream. That internal pull stabilized throughput and taught plants to ride volume swings without losing spec. When foreign orders wobbled, domestic projects kept the columns wet. Load factor is memory. Memory is product. The human glue mattered. An operator in Baotou knew which pump vibrated when the nitrate strength drifted. A maintenance crew in Ningbo could tear down and rebuild a sintering furnace by Monday dawn after a Saturday flare. A metallurgist in Tianjin could taste the air and tell you the phosphine scrubber wasn't quite right. Romantic? No, practical. Craft plus policy plus capital built a moat that wasn't visible on a resource map. By the mid-2000s, the ecosystem didn't just make inputs, it enforced outcomes. A buyer who wanted motors on time learned to sign with a magnet maker who had a metal supplier who had a separation partner who had a provincial license that wouldn't lapse mid-quarter. The chain was a neighborhood. If one address hit trouble, a truck 2 streets over filled the gap. Try replicating that with 3 scattered pilots and a leased warehouse. Call it a chokepoint if you like. On the ground, it's a series of doors that open because the last one did. The world kept knocking. The map stayed the same. The 2010 shock, the day the world blinked. 3 fishing boats and a patrol vessel collided near a cluster of rocks with 2 names, Senkaku to Japan, Dairoyu to China. The video didn't air, but the consequences did. While diplomats drafted statements, something subtler happened at the gates. Containers with oxides and metals bound for Japan started lingering at Chinese ports. Paperwork moved slower. Phones stopped being picked up. In Tokyo, buyers refreshed tracking pages and saw the same word for days, pending. Stakes were immediate for real people. A motor plant in Nagoya issued a quiet memo. Ration high-grade magnets to medical customers first, stretch the rest. A Tier 1 auto supplier in H pulled engineers into a weekend war room to triage models by torque requirement. The Defense Ministry called its procurement office and asked for a read on guidance components. How long before the backlog touched readiness? Nobody panicked on TV. On factory floors, the mood changed. Action traveled in price. Neodymium praseodymium oxide vaulted. Dysprosium, that thin layer of heat insurance for magnets, doubled, then tripled. Brokers who had shrugged at rare earths now fielded frantic calls. Buyers who swore they never hoarded started hoarding. Across Europe and the United States, procurement teams dusted off old contacts in Mountain Pass and Kuala Lumpur, called juniors with promising press releases, and asked the only question that mattered. Can you ship on spec in weeks, not quarters? Substitution talk filled whiteboards. Could ferrite motors carry the load with redesign? Could samarium cobalt stand in, or would corrosion and cost kill it? Electronics firms considered scaling back haptics. Wind developers debated smaller turbines with more units to dilute risk. Most options carried penalties. Rotate to ferrite and the motor grows. Jump to samarium cobalt and your supply risk shifts to a different price curve with a different geopolitical story. Even the companies that believed in alternatives faced one obstacle: certification timelines that didn't care about today's headlines. What nobody knew at the time, because control lists were still being drafted, was that the lesson would outlast the spat. China had used export quotas since the 200s, but this was a stress test. The signal wasn't just the customs lane, it was the revelation that the midstream map could be used as a diplomatic instrument. In response, Tokyo, Brussels, and Washington promised diversification. The WTO case followed, arguing that quotas and licensing distorted trade. Years later, Beijing would adjust the formalities. The leverage remained. Meanwhile, something else was happening on trading desks. Panic pushed prices beyond fundamentals, and then the whiplash set in. Projects that couldn't clear a hurdle rate at $20 per kilo looked heroic at $140. Capital pitched tents in conference rooms. Juniors raised money. Press releases multiplied. A year and change later, as flows normalized and prices sagged, many of those tents packed up. A few deposits advanced. Most didn't. The midstream misread surfaced again. Mines without separation partners simply exported hope. On the ground, Japanese industry didn't wait for court rulings to protect memory. The government funded recycling consortia to pull magnets out of hard drives and motors, turning scrap into feedstock. Companies invested in magnet-making capacity in country and in friendly jurisdictions and partnered with leaners to secure separated oxides outside China. They also learned a hard arithmetic. Recycling yields build slowly, and midstream skills can't be bought by decree. A decade later, the programs would matter. In 201, they were an answer for the next time, not this one. Impact in the United States carried a different flavor. Policy papers proliferated. Congressional hearings rehearsed the map we're still walking. Mountain Pass restarted under new ownership, cracked ore again, and shipped concentrates, then oxides, back into a world that still finished metals and magnets somewhere else. The bottleneck didn't move because the chemistry columns, crafting metals to purity and magnets to microstructure, still lived behind the same gates we'd already described. Mines turned on faster than separation plants learned to hit spec. This was the moment everything changed for perception. For years, rare earths sounded like a trivia answer. Suddenly, they were a line item in macro reports and a subplot in maritime disputes. Executives who'd never visited a mixer-settler bank found themselves wearing visitor badges in Ganju. Politicians toured tailings ponds in Inner Mongolia and came back with sound bites about independence. Then prices eased and attention drifted. The plants kept humming. In the aftermath, the WTO ruled against China's quotas. Beijing scrapped them and replaced them with tools that traveled better: consolidated licensing, environmental enforcement, and later, export controls on technologies and equipment. The 201 shock became a template. You didn't need a loud embargo to make a point. You needed a few quiet levers, inspection regimes, approvals, and a reminder that value-added lived up the chain. Buyers updated risk slides, then signed the same offtakes because reliability still lived where the steam rose. The lesson that stuck, at least for those who were waiting on crates, was simple. Chokepoints aren't press statements, they're friction. A week at customs can do what a tariff can't. A rumor in a solvent extraction hall can move a market more than a speech. In 2010, the world blinked, saw the map, and then looked away. The map didn't move. Inside the machine, separation, and the dirty moat. To really see the grip, step into the hall where the air tastes faintly of acid and metal. Solvent extraction isn't a lab trick, it's an industrial orchestra. Picture parallel trains of mixer-settlers, shallow boxes in long, repeating rows, where two immiscible liquids pass each other in counter-current flow, trading ions like dealers sliding chips across a table. Pumps set the rhythm. Agitators cut tiny droplets to maximize surface area. The choreography decides which element steps left and which slips right. Stakes first because they dictate everything. If the cut isn't clean, purity collapses downstream. Impurities at parts per million change magnet coercivity at 180 degrees C and crash yields on sintering days. Miss a praseodymium-neodymium split, and your alloy's microstructure won't form the desired grains. Your motor runs hot, your spec fails, your line stops. Every valve turn has a cost measured in hours of lost production and months of reputational debt. Operators feel that pressure at eye level. A column off by a pH decimal today becomes a failed acceptance test 3 suppliers away next quarter. Action looks like chemistry under discipline. The feed, cracked and leached ore turned into a pregnant liquor, enters the first stage. An organophosphorus extractant in kerosene meets an aqueous nitrate or chloride phase. At a certain pH, one lanthanide prefers the organic, its neighbor prefers the water. Adjust acidity by tenths and the preference flips. Run 80, 120, sometimes 180 stages to sharpen the separation, recycling raffinate and loaded organic while washing and scrubbing to strip co-extractants. Every 30 minutes, a tech pulls samples, titrates acidity, and charts a McCabe-Thiele diagram that only makes sense if you've been here long enough to see how theory bends under real feed. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the pipes. Trace contaminants, iron, calcium, silica phosphate, ride along and foul extractants. The fix isn't just swapping solvent, it's preconditioning the feed, adding complexants at just the right ratio, watching temperature creep, because viscosity nudges droplet size and residence time. 1 degree shifts phase disengagement, and a single bad disengagement foams a stage, knocks carryover into the next bank, and cascades into hours of cleaning. People talk about 100+ stages as if they're identical photocopies. They aren't. Early banks handle bulk moves, later ones shave fractions. Each bank has a personality shaped by weld quality, pump wear, and the crew that babysits it. Scale multiplies complexity. A pilot plant forgives slop. A commercial line magnifies it. Flow rates in cubic meters per hour demand control loops that don't drift. The control system paces pumps, dozers, and scrapers, but humans anchor the edge cases. A veteran can hear a stage sing wrong, too much cavitation, not enough shear. He'll tap a gauge, tweak an air bleed, and stop a runaway before the chart screams. That tacit skill is the moat you can't order from a catalog. Then there's the waste math, the part polite brochures skip. Every purification step generates raffinate streams loaded with salts and acids. Neutralizing them throws tons of gypsum-like solids. If the ore carried thorium or uranium traces, those solids read mildly radioactive. Ponds need engineered liners, capture wells, and monitoring. Water demand is relentless, washing organics, scrubbing crud, rinsing equipment. Recycling loops cut draw, but every loop adds its own failure modes. Price the true cost of effluent to Western standards, and the unit economics flip. Ignore it, and your operating margin looks heroic, until inspection day. China moved along that continuum over time, tightening, consolidating, and still keeping enough flexibility to stay price leader. That balance is the dirty moat, the willingness and capacity to manage or absorb waste at scale. Tacit knowledge deserves its own ledger. Operators learn that iron adsorption clays from southern hills feed a liquor that needs gentler gradients to avoid gelation. Bastnasite-derived feeds like more aggressive acidities but punish sloppy temperature control. Teams keep failure libraries, photos of phase inversion, logs of crud bursts, notes on when to swap a degraded extractant because its loading curve flattened. They run solvent health checks like a doctor reads blood work. That playbook is IP a lawyer files. It's muscle memory and a shop culture that treats small anomalies as future crises. Reliability is the product. Downstream magnet makers buy on-spec, on-time flows, not potential. They need oxide at narrow particle distributions or metal at tight interstitial impurity levels. Oxygen, carbon, nitrogen kept in single-digit ppm. That requires polishing steps, precipitation controls that set grain size, calcination schedules tuned to phase transformations, metal smelting in vacuums that don't burp. Miss oxygen by a whisper, and the magnet's grain boundaries won't take diffusion doping, killing high-temperature performance. That's why contracts tilt to incumbents. They've proven they can make boredom, same number, every week, through monsoon and cold snap. Here's where geography traps ambition. You can open a new mine in Australia or the US, but your concentrate still stares at a midstream gate. Even when you build a separation plant elsewhere, you start with a crew that hasn't stood midnight watch on a crud event. First-year yields wobble, customers hesitate. Banks demand take or pay you can't secure without a reliability record you don't yet have. Therefore, material loops back to the same addresses. Therefore, the moat defends itself. In the end, the machine's secret isn't chemistry alone. It's choreography plus consequence. Keep pH where it belongs, heat steady, solvents clean and waste contained, and you print trust. Slip and the pond grows, the spec slips, and the phone rings from a factory you'll never visit, asking why their line is quiet. The geography trap, mining vs. refining. While new holes got drilled in deserts and red dirt hills, concentrates kept boarding ships for the same destinations. Mountain Pass in California is the cleanest example. The mine restarted, or got cracked and leached into a rare earth carbonate or oxide stream, and then, here's the twist, it often needed to leave the country to become metal and magnet. The geology was American, the gate that mattered sat across the Pacific. Australia's leaners fought to break that loop. They dug at Mount Weld, shipped to a separation plant in Kuantan, Malaysia, and built toward metals and magnets with partners. It worked, partly. Community pushback forced tighter environmental controls and slower ramps. When customers needed guaranteed on-spec NdPr oxide every week, the safest path was still a purchase order to long-running Chinese plants. Mines can sprint, separation walks. Buyers don't wait for walking. Stakes for real people live in the calendar. A mining CEO can celebrate first ore, first concentrate, first cash. An OEM planner needs first magnet on time forever. Without a proven separating counterparty, a mine sells at a discount to incumbents who assume the yield risk and capture the reliability premium. Intermediate choke means the value stacks midstream. Upstream optimism meets midstream pricing power, and midstream wins. Action shows up in contracts. Concentrates require offtakers with a track record. solvent extraction banks that have run on this exact feed, with a data pack proving how cerium will be bled, how lanthanum will be routed, how the PRND cut will hold across seasonal temperature swings. That's why ore from diverse geologies, bastnasite, monazite, iron adsorption clays, keeps looping back to processes that can tune the dance fast. Every new separation plant must survive its messy first year, with customers who have zero tolerance for mess. Logistics math sharpens the trap. A bulk shipment from Fremantle to Tianjin adds weeks and thousands of miles, but costs less than a single day of a car plant sitting idle. Schedule risk beats freight cost every time. Incumbents leverage this with contractual lock-in, take-or-pay agreements, penalties for off-spec feed, quality clauses that define on-time more strictly than airport timetables. A junior miner signs because they must. The incumbent processor smiles because they can. Meanwhile, something else is happening in spreadsheets you'll never see. Processors offer tolling deals. Send us your concentrate, we'll return separated oxides minus a fee and a yield share. On paper, it de-risks capital for the miner. In practice, it cements reliance on the processor's secret sauce. If the miner ever tries to switch, they face a requalification cycle that spooks their customers. The ore body becomes hostage to a flow sheet written in someone else's building. Quiet leverage shows up at alloy and magnet houses too. Even if a mine finds a non-Chinese separator, the next step, turning oxide into metal, metal into strip cast alloy, alloy into sintered magnets with specific grain boundary diffusion, often sits in the same coastal zones that learn to treat purity as routine. A European or Japanese magnet maker can and does produce world-class parts, but scale is the sword. When gigawatt-hours of motors need magnets now, the plants that can pull 24/7 at volume write the price and the queue. The trap isn't just technical, it's legal and cultural. Feed qualification can take 6 to 18 months of test runs, audits, and pilot lots. Contracts carry most favored clauses and exclusivity windows. Switching midstream partners isn't like changing a shipping lane. It's like changing a surgeon mid-operation. Everyone in the room prefers the hands they know. A micro-story from Western Australia. A junior celebrates a maiden shipment of concentrate. The next week, they send a team to a Chinese separation plant to observe trial runs. The plant manager greets them with a ledger of similar feeds and a schedule slot next Tuesday. Samples flow, pH ladders adjust on the fly. 3 months later, the miner has saleable NdPr oxide. The alternative, a greenfield separator back home, still waits on permits, financing, and a team that's never ridden out a crud bloom at 3 a.m. Unknown to faraway boardrooms, midstream processors curate feed portfolios like asset managers. They blend ores to smooth impurity spikes, hedge reagent supply, and maintain solvent health. If a feed threatens crud rates, it gets throttled or priced harder. If a mine's logistics slip, their slot slides down the queue. Geography doubles as governance. Proximity to reagents, spare parts, skilled repair crews, and port access compounds advantage. Impact ripples back to the mine plan. When tolling or offtake terms cut margins thin, miners chase volume to make up revenue, pushing benches faster and raising strip ratios sooner. Cash flow improves, unit economics strain. The processor doesn't mind. Their queue grows, their bargaining power thickens, and their customers sleep better. The miners' share price pops on tonnage, not capture of midstream value. Here's the clincher. Even when non-Chinese separation scales, Malaysia, Estonia, a pilot in Texas, the road often still loops back for metals and magnets. A single missing step keeps the cycle dependent. A magnet factory's furnace profile is tuned to a supplier's alloy. Change the alloy and you change the furnace, the dyes, the diffusion recipe, and the failure modes. That's months of requalification while orders pile. Operations managers don't roll that dice unless forced. So mining announcements keep multiplying, and refining capacity still decides the future. The map looks diversified at the pit and concentrated at the pump house, until mines, separators, metal makers, and magnet lines live inside the same non-Chinese clusters, sharing people, parts, and panic rooms. The concentrates we celebrate will keep sailing back to the same gates. The new Scramble, alternatives, hype, and hard limits. While all kept circling back to the same gates, governments and companies started sketching exits. In Washington, Canberra, Ottawa, rebuild plans landed with fanfare. The promise was simple: rebuild the midstream, stitch it to magnet lines, and turn vulnerability into industry. The reality showed up in commissioning logs: partial capacity, narrow throughput, long debugging tails. Start with the rebuilds you can visit. In the US, Mountain Pass advanced beyond carbonate, pushing into separated oxides with a roadmap to metal. Texas announced pilot separations and magnet fabs tied to defense contracts. Australia's Lenas added lines in Malaysia and broke ground at home. Canada floated refineries in Saskatchewan and Ontario, chasing ion exchange flowsheets tailored to their feeds. These weren't press releases, they were concrete and steel. But they shared a constraint. Each plant could handle only certain chemistries at volumes that left global demand barely dented. Live production punished optimism. Yields wandered their first year. Customers tested lots, accepted some, rejected others, and hedged by keeping their Chinese allocations warm. Alliances arrived to underwrite patience. The EU published critical raw materials acts and deployment targets. Japan co-financed non-Chinese flows and magnet plants, building on the decade-old lesson of 201. Korea leaned into materials strategy, backing powder metallurgy and motor integration to buy down risk. These moves mattered because they moved risk. A magnet line with firm defense offtake can bleed through the messy middle without dying. A separator with a European anchor customer can fix crud problems without its lenders pulling the plug. But alliances don't print operators. They buy time for people to become them. Meanwhile, new frontiers flashed on maps. Greenland's rare earth-bearing deposits promised scale. Politics and environmental scrutiny promised delays. In Africa, projects in Tanzania, Burundi, Malawi, and Madagascar advanced, each with unique metallurgies, community expectations, and power constraints. Belt and road tie-ins surfaced in port loans and processing MOUs, reminding everyone that geology without financing is a postcard. Some ore bodies looked clean, others carried penalty elements that turned separation into a chemistry marathon. A project could be world-class on grade and still stumble on water, reagents, or a bridge that trucks can't cross in rainy season. Deep-sea mining entered the conversation like a dare. Nodules on abyssal plains, rich in nickel, manganese, cobalt, and yes, trace rare earths, looked like a way to skip land politics. The geology sat a mile down, wrapped in ecological unknowns. Pilot collectors sucked nodules, environmental monitors recorded plumes and biota stress. Island nations asked about social license. Tech firms called the metal mix tempting, insurers called the liability undefined. Even if regulations greenlit trials tomorrow, magnet-grade flows would take years to standardize. The ocean wasn't a shortcut, it was a different map with slower clocks. Hype surged alongside hard limits. Startups pitched rare earth-free motors, switched reluctance, axial flux, high-temperature superconducting. Some worked for narrow lanes, forklifts, low-cost EV trims, wind turbines with larger nacelles. But torque density is a bully. In compact, high-performance applications, NdFeB still wins on watts per kilogram and heat resilience. Each magnet-free announcement carried footnotes: cost, acoustic signature, control complexity, scarce cooling headroom. Substitution shifts demand, it doesn't erase it. Recycling looked like a bright lever because it rode existing metal. Japan's consortia pulled magnets from hard drives, Europe funded urban mines, US labs demonstrated magnet-to-magnet loops, hydrogen decrepitation, selective leaching, powder resintering. The catch: collection rates, logistics, contamination, and product design. Heterogeneous scrap with mixed chemistries complicates re-entry to tight specs. The wins are steady, compounding, they just aren't sprinting. You can't recycle the first generation of a build-out you haven't completed yet. Then the quiet math surfaced. Bankability rests on offtakes, minimum volumes, and performance guarantees. New separators need long, patient contracts at prices that reflect true waste handling and learning curve loss. Magnet plants need customers who will tolerate early variance while tooling settles. Governments can anchor with defense and grid procurements. Commercial buyers can layer reliability premiums, a cent here, a nickel there, that make Boredom profitable. Without those, spreadsheets default to incumbents. With them, the new map thickens. Microstory: A European wind OEM signed a 5-year offtake with a non-Chinese magnet maker at a premium tied to uptime guarantees. Year 1 hurt, rework, retuning, a recall on a small batch. Year 2 held. Year 3, a heat wave stressed everyone. Their line kept shipping on spec. The premium looked cheap compared to crane time on offshore towers. Unknown to viewers of ribbon cuttings, the hardest limit is people. A solvent extraction hall needs operators who have seen a phase inversion and don't blink. A metal shop needs technicians who can smell a vacuum leak before gauges twitch. A magnet press needs hands that feel when powder flows wrong. Training programs are starting. Apprenticeships in Texas, Malaysia, Western Australia. Exchange cohorts with Japanese and European veterans, but craft travels at human speed. China isn't standing still while others sprint. As rebuilds begin, Beijing nudges up the stack, integrating magnets into motors, motors into drive units, and drive units into cars, turbines, appliances. Export controls shift from material to know-how and equipment, narrowing leakage routes. Domestic recycling scales a step ahead, soaking internal scrap and thin film sources. The chokepoint doesn't disappear, it evolves. So the Scramble splits into two truths. There are exits, and they work slowly locally at costs that reflect the bill we avoided. And there are limits that speeches can't erase. Chemistry has a tempo, permits have a tempo, trust has a tempo. The only way out is through those tempos, paid for up front, measured in boredom later. Strategic consequences, the military edge. Start with the grams that steer billions. In a guidance unit the size of a soda can, a ring of NdFeB magnets holds torque through heat and stress. Add a whisper of dysprosium or terbium at the grain boundaries, and the magnet stops demagnetizing at 180 degrees C. Take that whisper away, and your actuator droops under load. It's not drama, it's physics writing a flight path. Stakes are human before they're geopolitical. A maintenance chief in Utah opens a tote of fin actuators for a missile test. The serials match, the paperwork's clean, but a lot from an alternate supplier drifts on the dynamometer after thermal cycling. She signs a red tag, hold for engineering review. A test slips a week. Schedules ripple downrange. Readiness isn't a speech. It's whether a rack slot stays empty long enough to matter. Meanwhile, something else is happening on the carrier deck. A radar tech needs servo drives that don't drift when cabinets heat during sustained operations. Those drives use micromotors packed with high-grade magnets because there's no room for bulk. As the supply queue lengthens, a substitution plan lands on his bench. Lower-grade magnets with thicker laminations, new control firmware, retest in hot hold. He can make it work. He can't make time expand. Small parts, big outcomes is not a metaphor. A jet engine's variable stator vanes rely on actuators that must hold position at temperatures where aluminium softens. A ship's electric drive wants dense torque without a weight penalty that steals range. A drone swarm needs grams saved to buy sensors and endurance. Each application leans on magnets whose performance window is narrow and unforgiving. Miss a window, and the penalty shows up as seconds to lock, meters of SEP, or nautical miles lost. Action looks like triage. When export paperwork turns sticky or a plant pushes customers to the back of the queue, with quality reassessment, program offices split their inventories. Flight critical gets first draw. Trainers and test cells take the downgrades. Depot-level maintenance extends cannibalization authority, pulling parts from sidelined airframes to keep frontline units at numbers commanders can brief. The practice is old. The cadence accelerates when deliveries slip by months, not days. The wargame that planners run isn't a blockade, it's a slow drip. Trim a few percent from shipments, add a month to lead times, tighten quality thresholds so more lots need rework. The result is not headlines, it's attrition in the schedule. Aircraft availability ticks down a point or two each quarter. Missile production misses a lot allocation. A destroyer's overhaul adds weeks while waiting for drives. In a long contest, those points stack until a commander chooses between presence here and surge there. Substitutes exist with Scarce. Ferrite motors can drive pumps and fans. They're bulky and inefficient in cramped bays. Samarium cobalt magnets hold heat without dysprosium, but cobalt price and corrosion, behavior change, design and cost. Rare earth-free switched reluctance machines cut magnet dependence, but add acoustic signatures and control complexity, a poor trade in platforms where stealth and EMI discipline matter. Every alternative requires requalification under military environmental testing, shock, vibration, salt fog, thermal extremes. That's money and years, not weeks. Stockpiles help, then don't. A classified warehouse racks crates of NdPr oxide, dimetal, finished magnets in common sizes, but militaries consume parts that sit in systems for decades. The pipeline blends spares with new builds and midlife upgrades. Draw too fast in a squeeze, and you reveal a hollow inventory just as reprocurement stretches. Draw too slow, and your readiness stands on paper. What nobody outside program offices appreciates is how quality drifts can be weaponized without a single embargo. Quiet quality shifts, magnets that meet spec on paper but ride the edge, force conservative derates. A radar array that could run at full duty cycles now operates with thermal margins widened. An actuator advertised for 5,000 hours gets pulled at 3,000 out of caution. Availability numbers stay acceptable, performance under stress bends downward. Micro story: a missile motor assembly line in Alabama gets a call. The magnet house can deliver on time, but the die content will be lower, offset by a new diffusion profile. The engineering team convenes. They test a batch. It passes bench tests, then fails a hot-soaked torque hold at hour 47. The vendor offers a second tweak. The calendar doesn't care. The line pauses. A contractor sends a memo to the customer with a revised delivery plan. A colonel revises a training schedule. Nobody on TV sees any of this. Defense First Underwriting tries to counter the drip. The Pentagon signs anchor offtakes for oxides, metals, and magnets in the United States and allied countries. It funds magnet fabs near motor houses, paying premiums for reliability. It writes specs that allow performance-based buys, not lowest cost once. That helps plants ride the learning curve without bankruptcy. It doesn't conjure tacit knowledge overnight. Allies matter. Japan's magnet makers can hit world-class specs, and Europe has pockets of excellence in specialty magnets and drives, but their volumes tilt toward industrial and automotive, not wartime surges. Coordinating stockpiles, qualification data, and surge plans across borders takes trust and legal plumbing. A screw-up here isn't a PR miss, it's a gap on a flight line. Here's the part planners whisper: risk clusters stack. A Taiwan flashpoint spikes demand for precision munitions exactly when commercial EV and wind demand are peaking. Sanctions spiral, insurance premiums spike, ports clog, and even friendly suppliers miss ships. The midstream cushion thins to the fabric. On paper, readiness meets the physics of magnets and the calendar of ships. You can wargame intent. You can't wargame metallurgical lead time away. The edge lives in boredom. If a magnet arrives on spec, every time through heat and holiday, the jet flies when ordered and the ship sails when tasked. That boring arrival is built in solvent halls, metal shops, and magnet presses we chose to outsource. Until the exits we're building make boredom domestic and allied, the grams that steer billions answer to someone else's schedule. Strategic consequences: the civilian shock. Start with a motor no one thinks about. An elevator in a hospital rises a little slower this month because the drive unit shipped with a lower grade magnet. The difference is seconds. The consequence is a queue in the lobby that wasn't there last year. Multiply that across cities, and you start to see how grams in a rotor set the tempo of daily life. EVs feel it first. Traction motors love dense torque. When the magnet grade slips or the queue stretches, production planners redraw calendars. A model year that was supposed to launch in April moves to July. A dealer gets fewer units, the waitlist grows. The explanation mentions component availability. The internal note says the NdPr allocation was cut 12%, and the die budget is now rationed to performance trims. Engineers crank on workarounds, tweak winding counts, widen laminations, accept slightly louder whine under load. Each tweak robs a mile of range here, a tenth of a second of 60 there. Marketing rewrites brochures. Customers just wait. Wind power meets the same wall at a different scale. Direct drive turbines use big ring magnets because gearboxes hate maintenance at sea. When magnet deliveries slip, nacelles stack in yards. Developers push grid connection dates, then renegotiate penalties. A coastal town that expected kilowatts in summer buys gas peakers to bridge. Rates nudge up. The announcement blames weather. The procurement file points to magnet crates that missed a ship. Meanwhile, smartphones wear the shock quietly. A haptic motor under glossy screens swaps to a cheaper ferrite design in a mid-range line. It works, just less crisp. A camera stabilization unit widens tolerances to accommodate a magnet that runs closer to its thermal edge. Users notice only in low light at the end of a hot day when the video jitters. Forums blame firmware. The root cause is metallurgy. Hospitals don't call headlines either. MRI manufacturers juggle installation schedules because gradient coils and moving tables rely on precise motors. A small clinic waits 6 weeks longer for a machine that was promised by spring. Patients drive farther for scans. A radiologist pulls an extra shift. Nobody screams, everyone adapts. Price elasticity turns small shortages into big delays. An automaker can't absorb a sudden 20% magnet price spike without shifting trims, so they steer scarce magnets to high-margin variants. Entry models slip or vanish from lots in certain regions. An appliance maker moves a quiet dishwasher launch because the motor's new magnet profile adds a hum they can't tune out on time. OEMs triage, safety critical, then performance, then comfort. Consumers experience it as fewer choices and surprise upgrades that cost more. Startups promise routes around the bottleneck, rare earth-free motors with clever control algorithms. Some ship, especially for fleets that can tolerate acoustic signatures and larger housings. A warehouse robot hums louder. A compact city car accepts a bit more weight. But when you pack power into tight spaces, sleek sedans, e-bikes, drones, HVAC units in dense apartments, the ND-FB advantage is tough to beat without trade-offs users notice. Energy transition schedules collide with materials reality. Policy charts assume gigawatt factories, gigafleets of EVs, and forests of turbines by certain dates. The magnet Q says, add months. Carbon math hates months. A utility hedges with gas to keep reliability through a narrow winter margin. Emissions dip less than planned. Investors downgrade a project's green premium. The critique blames bureaucracy. The fix, infuriatingly, is more midstream capacity and stockpiles that make boring delivery possible. Consumers pay in strange places. Extended warranties creep up because parts stress under hotter duty cycles when magnet coercivity is shaved. Pro tiers quietly reserve the best motors while base models carry the compromise. Software updates arrive to shift torque curves away from thermal cliffs. People argue about patches while the parts calendar drives the code. Black markets sprout in the seams. Scrap dealers flip pulled magnets at premiums. Counterfeiters plate poor alloy and slip it into aftermarket supply. Reliability dips for repair shops that can't police metallurgy. A scooter fleet in a tropical city sees higher failure in monsoon season because a lot of cheap motors demagnetize at heat. Riders assume brand fatigue. Fleet managers file insurance claims and swap vendors. Stockpiles buy breathing room, then turn into mirages if replenishment lags. Governments and firms release material into the market. Delivery schedules normalize for a quarter. The relief masks the gap between current demand and non-Chinese supply. When the draw ends, the queue returns, sometimes tighter because buyers postponed hard choices. Workarounds become design language. Engineers spec magnet chemistries that use less dysprosium and deepen grain boundary diffusion, nursing performance out of fewer critical grams. Product managers learn to introduce models with regional variant motors tied to supply confidence. Logistics teams negotiate buffer inventories and pay small premiums for on-time assurance. Reliability gets priced, not just parts. A micro-story from Pune. An EV startup promised deliveries by Diwali. The magnet supplier missed 2 lots. The team rewrote software to protect motors under hill climbs, pushed the launch into December, and offered early buyers free fast-charging credits. Most customers stayed. A few cancelled for a rival who lucked into a better allocation that quarter. In the lab, a young engineer added one note to the next-gen spec. Dual-source magnets, qualified 6 months before SOP, no exceptions. Here's the quiet headline. When a Chokepoint tightens, civilian life doesn't collapse. It frays. Products arrive later, sound different, run a bit hotter, cost a bit more, timelines slip. Networks absorb stress until they don't. The fix isn't a slogan. It's paying for boredom, redundant plants, verified recycling loops, long offtakes, and specs that reward resilience. Until then, the magnet in your next appliance is a calendar you can't see, and it's already late. The finance trap: cheap today, fragile tomorrow. Follow the money into the middle, where spreadsheets made the same quiet choice for 20 years. Midstream plants, cracking, leaching, separation metals, sat between a rock with headlines and a product with brand margins. Investors looked at razor-thin spreads, environmental liabilities, and long debugging cycles and said, "Not our game." Capital chased upstream reserves that photograph well and downstream devices that storytell well. The middle got priced like a nuisance. Cheap today, fragile tomorrow. Stakes show up as who writes checks when weather, policy, or a customs queue snaps. If you misprice the dirtiest, most failure-prone step, you underwrite brittleness in everything that follows: EV launches, turbine installs, hospital MRI replacements, munitions lines. The cost doesn't vanish. It moves. It lands as premiums for urgent freight, overtime for requalification, warranty creep, and stockpiles that decay in silence. Finance decided to pay later at high interest instead of earlier at cost. Action started with a simple penalty. Regulatory risk in the midstream got treated like a litigation magnet. Western facilities carried consent decree shadows and cleanup tails that spooked lenders. When a pro forma modeled solvent extraction fouling or tailings ponds with radionuclides, the sensitivity table glowed red. Meanwhile, incumbent clusters offered tolling at a known price, no capex, no commissioning drama, spec met. Procurement signed the toll. CFOs logged savings. The opportunity cost: lost muscle memory, lost bargaining power, didn't hit a quarter, it hit a decade. Bankability requires certainty in 3 places: offtake volumes, on-spec performance, and waste compliance that won't explode the balance sheet. New separators fail on all 3 in year 1. Yields wander, customers hedge. Permits carry community clauses that tighten after the first odor complaint. The project finance model breaks when take-or-pay contracts demand boring reliability that only incumbents can currently promise. So banks widen debt spreads or require sovereign guarantees. Without anchor buyers willing to pay for the learning curve, projects stall at glossy decks. This is how externalities become line items elsewhere. If a province swallows effluent handling, global sticker prices drop, and buyers everywhere applaud their cost discipline. That delta is not free. It's a transfer from lungs and water tables in one district to shareholder returns in another. When watchdogs or central authorities raise standards and shut egregious operators, prices rise and volatility spikes. The buyer calls it market shock. It's the unpaid invoice arriving with penalties. Meanwhile, something else was happening in contracts. Procurement normalized spot buys and quarterly reprices for materials with multi-year process memory. That's rational behavior when you assume interchangeable suppliers. It's reckless when your supply actually lives behind 2 or 3 gates. A midstream plant can't staff, maintain solvent health, and optimize flow sheets on spot whims. Reliability comes from boring, locked-in throughput. Spot erodes that. Everyone got cheaper inventory. No one bought resilience. Offtakes reflected the same blindness. Device makers wrote purity specs like a wall and price targets like a cliff, but offered no upside for never-miss delivery. The result was adversarial math. New entrants ate the ramp cost alone and died mid-curve. Incumbents offered assurance fees embedded in price, small, steady premiums buyers barely noticed. Those fees weren't listed. They were the moat. Then the timeline conflict matured into policy failure. Investor horizons run 3 to 7 years. Midstream capacity needs a decade to plan, permit, build, foul, fix, and become boring. Governments announced critical mineral strategies and offered grants that covered steel and pipes, not boredom. Plants turned on, stumbled, and faced lenders with covenants tied to quarterly throughput. A bad monsoon, a crud event, or a reagent shortage tripped a ratio. Boards blinked. Programs quietly reprofiled or paused. Micro story: a North American separator closed a financing with a blue-chip OEM expression of interest instead of a binding offtake. The first year brought crud blooms and a heat wave that pushed viscosity out of spec. The OEM bought 60% of planned volume and filled the gap with incumbent material. The plant missed covenants by 2 quarters. The next round priced in distress. 6 months later, the line ran better, but ownership had flipped, and the technicians who learned the curve got pink slips. the know-how walked out the door. ESG reporting didn't save the middle either. Companies published glossy sustainability PDFs, while procurement teams squeezed pennies on magnet contracts. Auditors counted carbon, no one counted fragility. The metric rewarded price per kilo, not failures avoided. So dollars flowed to the cheapest column, not the steadiest. When a shipment failed in August and a line sat quiet, the ESG leader filed a force majeure note and moved on. As a way to price truth, of course it looks expensive. Reliability premiums tied to uptime and performance, not just deliveries. Multi-year take-or-pay with ratchets that share early pain and late gain. Higher premiums in year one that step down as yields settle, with rebates for zero missed lots. Waste handling transparency with third-party verification that unlocks lower-cost capital. Insurance products that wrap learning curve risk, so banks stop pricing every separator like a chemical bomb. Defense can and should anchor this. A guaranteed multi-material stack, oxide, metal, alloy, magnet, backed by procurement that values on time at heat, not lowest bid at award. Civilian buyers can ride behind those anchor flows and pay modest assurance cents per motor, per turbine, per MRI mover. It's not charity. It's risk pricing that ends the subsidy of fragility. Unknown to people far from pump houses, the cheapest number on a spreadsheet is often a loan you didn't know you took. It compounds through delays, redesigns, overtime, and trust lost. Pay for boring today, and the interest stops. Refuse, and the next customs slowdown will rewrite your calendar for you. The hard rebuild, what it would actually take. Start with the permits, because nothing spins without trust. A separation plant isn't a ribbon cutting, it's a negotiation with the town's water table. You sit in a gym under fluorescent lights and explain tailings chemistry to people who know where the creek floods. You show liners, leachate capture wells, real-time monitoring portals anyone can check on their phone. You promise alarms that text the fire chief at 2 a.m. You price closures up front, bonded, ring-fenced, not wishful. If the meeting ends with a handshake instead of a headline, you've built the first piece of capacity, consent. Then the water, solvent extraction drinks and returns thousands of cubic meters a day. Recycling loops cut draw, but they need redundancy. Spare filters, backup pumps, a cooling tower that doesn't throttle on the first heat wave. You line up rights with the utility, map drought scenarios, and install meters the community can see. When a drought comes, you don't plead. You pivot, shift to night cycles, increase reuse, slow a train before a pond fills. A plant that thinks it can hide water usage dies in year 2. A plant that publishes it survives long enough to get boring. People are the next permit. You can't hire operators from a staffing app and expect them to hear a stage sing wrong. You build a school in the plant, a solvent extraction lab with transparent tanks to show phase disengagement, a mock mixer settler to practice crud busts, a metal shop with a vacuum furnace you can foul on purpose. Pair apprentices with veterans from Japan, Europe, or the few North American lines still running. Pay them to fail safely for 6 months. Keep a failure library on the wall, photos, logged incidents, lessons with names attached. Give shift leads something precious, time to teach. Tacit knowledge isn't a slogan, it's a schedule line. Colocation is non-negotiable. Mine to refinery to alloy to magnet within trucking distance, or you bleed confidence. A cluster slashes latency on everything that goes wrong. A pump cavitates, a reagent shipment runs late, a furnace seal cracks. When your separator can roll a cart of on-spec NdPr to the metal shop next door by noon, and that shop can deliver strip-cast alloy to a magnet line by midnight, contracts change. Engineers stand in the same room and argue over coercivity while pointing at parts, not PDFs. The minute you stretch those steps across oceans, the calendar takes control back. Industrial policy isn't a speech, it's a purchase order. Defense Procurement Act authorities can anchor oxide, metal, alloy, and magnet lines with multi-year buys that don't evaporate at the first hiccup. Tax credits targeted at midstream, not just shiny end products, tilt spreadsheets toward patience. Long off-takes with ramp premiums, more in year one, stepping down as yields settle, turn early pain into an investment instead of a bankruptcy. Write the contracts to pay for on-time, on-spec delivery, with rebates for zero missed lots. Give CFOs a reason to love boredom. Regulators have a role beyond yes or no. Build a single permitting window with tight service SLAs, publish plant dashboards that stream pH, flow, and discharge data, and deputize third-party auditors whose reports go public by default. If a plant catches itself before an inspector does, reward it. Fewer random checks next quarter, faster variance approvals for process improvements. If it hides a spill, you don't negotiate, you shut it. The goal isn't leniency. It's credible discipline that industry and neighbors can plan around. Now the parts list that sounds dull and decides the outcome. Mixer settlers by the dozen, pumps with spares on site, extractants under long-term contracts with multiple suppliers, acid and base storage sized for weather shocks, a boiler that doesn't sputter on peak days, a waste lab that can run radioisotope checks in-house without waiting on a courier, a solvent reclamation loop that pays for itself in a year, a spares room that looks like a hardware store, seals, gauges, impellers, motors, with barcodes tied to maintenance logs. Supply chains inside the fence matter too. Don't depend on a single truck route for reagents. Buy rail spurs where you can. Cross-qualify packaging so an oxide can ship to your metal shop or in a pinch to an ally's. Build common flanges and hose sets across trains so swapping equipment doesn't require a new safety protocol. Standardize controls so operators can move lines without relearning the screens. Everywhere you can make sameness, you buy resilience. Recycling isn't a side project. Co-locate magnet-to-magnet lines with your magnet plant. Install hydrogen decrepitation units to crack scrap into powder. Set up chemical leach lines tuned to your alloys, not generic e-waste. Sign contracts with motor reman shops, hard drive recyclers, and OEM service centers so your feed arrives sorted, labeled, and pre-checked for contaminants. Publish yields, then push design for disassembly back to customers. Screws instead of glue, snap fits that don't shatter magnets. A plant that eats its own scrap rides downturns without layoffs. Workforce stays or leaves based on dignity as much as pay. Rotate shifts sanely. Put a clinic on site. Offer hazard bonuses tied to measurable safety behaviors, not injury-free bingo. Build ladders, operator to lead to trainer to process engineer. Fund a local community college program. Teach solvent extraction and vacuum metallurgy as trades with credentials. Put a bilingual safety manager on every shift if your town needs it. The line between a plant people defend at the town hall and one they fight in court is how it treats their bodies. Finally, plan for failure. Write playbooks for crud blooms, solvent contamination, power dips, extreme cold snaps, and a broken import route. Drill them like fire drills. Run a dark day where you switch to islanded power and minimal water draw. Stock a war chest of reagents and spares sized for a quarter, not a week. Contract a second landfill before the first is half full. Put a standing MOU with an allied separator to take your feed if a tornado hits your roof. Your customers will ask for this. Answer with binders and signatures, not vibes. While plans draft, Beijing climbs the ladder. Magnets into motors, motors into drives, drives into vehicles. That's the clock you're racing. The rebuild isn't just building boxes. It's building boredom at home, plants that run so steadily your kids forget they were controversial. That takes consent, craft, co-location, contracts, and consequences that arrive on time. Pay for all 5 and the choke point loosens. Skimp on 1 and the road loops back to the same gates. China's next moves up the value chain. While others draft playbooks, Beijing rewrites the field lines. The midstream wasn't an end state, it was a launch pad. If you own separation, you can price reliability. If you can price reliability, you can pull customers up the chain. Oxides to metal, metal to magnets, magnets to motors, motors to systems. Integration isn't a slogan, it's a calendar that moves in your direction. Start with magnets, because that's where leverage turns tactile. Policies nudged manufacturers to scale sintered ND-Phoebe and bonded variants under consolidated groups. Grain boundary diffusion that squeezes dysprosium use, strip casting that prints uniform microstructure, vacuum furnaces with uptime logs like airline schedules, all standardized and multiplied. A motor house next door can call at noon for a tweak on a skew pattern and see parts by tomorrow. That response time becomes a habit, and habits become contracts. Then the step that matters for vehicles, Moat inverter gearbox units built as sealed drive systems. A magnet plant feeds a motor line. The motor line shares a wall with an inverter lab that designs around the magnet's exact thermal profile. The gearbox team sits with them, trading torque ripple fixes for housing weight. A car maker shows up and buys the block, not the parts. If a competitor wants to peel the magnet out, they inherit not just a component gap, but an integration problem that's been tuned across millions of units. Substitution gets harder as the bundle gets tighter. Battery materials integrate too, linking to rare earths in ways that aren't obvious on a periodic table. Cathode and anode supply chains, nickel, manganese, cobalt, lithium, graphite, already run at Chinese speed. Tie those to motor systems built around reliable magnets, and you get EV platforms that treat torque and range as solved variables, not lab experiments. The sales pitch is boring on purpose. Warranty on the drive unit that outlives the finance term, thermal derate curves that barely bend in a Chongqing summer or a Harbin winter. Reliability wins middle-class buyers, scale follows. Meanwhile, wind marches the same route. Direct drive turbines prioritize magnets to skip gearboxes. Domestic component makers, generator frames, power electronics, blades, sit inside logistics loops the length of a highway, not an ocean. If a magnet batch drifts, a field service team gets a revised rotor segment in days, a crane window is held, and a grid connection date doesn't slip. That performance is a procurement story first, an energy story second. Global reach underwrites the feed. Partnerships in Africa and Southeast Asia secure concentrate and mixed rare earth carbonate, stitched to processing MOUs that move steps closer to Chinese-controlled plants or affiliates. A refinery in a partner country gets financing, equipment packages, training cohorts, and reagent contracts pre-arranged. Offtake is spoken for before the first pour. When critics call it lock-in, the answer is delivery. When rivals call it dependency, the answer is jobs. Either way, the columns stay wet. Export controls shift focus from material to know-how. Lists that once named elements now include furnace designs, diffusion techniques, process control software, even QA methods tied to microstructure verification. A foreign buyer can purchase magnets, but the recipe and the calibration culture don't travel. If a partner wants to grow, they can, inside the ecosystem's rules, with fixtures, powders, and service contracts that keep them close. Open the box, get the part, not the playbook. Recycling grows before anyone else is ready. Domestic magnet-to-magnet lines scale beyond DMOS, hydrogen decrepitation for end-of-life motors, selective leach schemes that separate ND and PR from complex scrap, powder refinement that returns to sintering without purity drift. OEMs sign return agreements embedded in warranties. Logistics firms add magnet capture to dismantling SOPs. It's not circular perfection. It's fewer virgin tons needed to defend the schedule when imports hiccup. A micro story, a Tier 2 appliance maker in Guangdong wanted to launch a quiet motor for premium washers. They walked across 3 streets, a magnet house that cut coercivity variance in half, a motor team that tuned slot fill and skew, an inverter lab that mapped switching to the new torque ripple. 8 weeks later, a pilot line hit yield. The brand advertised silent wash, but the win was in the supply tab, stable allocations through Lunar New Year and summer peaks. Inside factories, software becomes glue. MES systems track lots from oxide to motor test stand, linking a magnet's grain size distribution to a vehicle's end-of-line torque trace. If a lot drifts, upstream recalibrates before downstream rejigs, because the dashboards share tags and timestamps. When a foreign buyer asks for PPAPs and FMEAs, they get binders with histograms that look like heartbeat monitors. Compliance turns into sales. Domestic demand protects experimentation. When an inverter topography saves $2 at scale, or a magnet coating erases a corrosion mode, a pilot run doesn't need a foreign anchor. A regional appliance program or municipal bus fleet absorbs the first 1,000 units. Lessons cycle back to export lines with scars already healed. That loop matures craft faster than plants fed by occasional foreign orders. Unknown to some in faraway boardrooms, the game board is shifting from who has ore to who owns boring. China's next moves make Boredom a product. Magnets that don't drift, motors that don't whine, drive units that don't fail hot, all delivered on schedules that don't slip. The Chokepoint tightens not with drama, but with convenience. If everyone else wants out, they'll have to build not just chemistry, but neighborhoods where magnets, motors, inverters, recyclers, and repair crews share coffee and crisis. Until then, the calendar stays local. The slow squeeze, death by delay. Here's how a chokepoint tightens without alarms. Not a ban, not a headline, a 5–10% trim on monthly allocations, a temporary quality hold on 2 lots, a new certification form that adds 2 weeks to customs. None of it looks like a crisis. All of it feels like one if your production calendar runs at the edge. Stakes first, because the squeeze lives in schedules. An EV plant in Ohio loses a week of magnets this quarter, then 4 days next quarter. The line manager reorganizes shifts, brings maintenance forward, slips a model variant to save the premium trims. A wind project off Aberdeen sees a pair of nacelles sit in a yard because a rotor segment missed a ship. Crews shuffle to another site. Crane rentals get extended at ugly rates. A hospital in Madrid waits an extra month for replacement drive units on an MRI table because the motor vendor is rationing high coercivity magnets to defense contracts. No one calls a press conference. Everyone adjusts and pays. Action travels in quiet levers. A processor moves routine, quality thresholds a notch tighter, which means more lots go to rework and fewer sail on time. An export license queue grows after an internal policy memo reprioritizes domestic strategic sectors, so a magnet maker's slot slides from week 3 to week 5 without a single denial letter. A dysprosium-containing powder gets recharacterized for safety, triggering new documentation at ports. The shipment isn't refused, it's delayed until the paperwork learns a new dance. OEM triage becomes policy. Performance trims and specialty motors get the cleanest magnets. Mid-tier and base models accept downgraded grades paired with firmware that protects torque at heat with gentler curves. The changes are subtle. A sporty variant hits 60/10 slower than the brochure promised. A dishwasher's silent mode advertises 1 decibel higher and ships in October, not August. A drone maker shifts a mid-range model to a ferrite design and calls it rugged, then updates battery life claims with smaller print. Each move is rational. Together, they change the shape of a market. Meanwhile, something else is happening in procurement. Buyers sign assurance options that cost a little extra per unit for an earlier slot in the queue. A premium tier of on-time delivery emerges, a reliability surcharge that incumbents can command because their boredom is proven. New entrants struggle to play. They can match a price. They can't mint trust overnight, so their orders slide to the right when the calendar tightens. The squeeze rewards the plants that already set the beat. Black markets move in the shadows the delay creates. Scrap flows carry higher bounties. Brokers flip reclaimed magnets and mislabeled alloy through third countries. An aftermarket floods with counterfeit parts that pass a handheld Gauss meter and fail in summer heat. A scooter fleet in Manila logs a spike in controller over temp faults. The parts look right. The metallurgy is. Warranty claims rise. Insurers quietly adjust premiums for operators that source outside verified chains. Stockpiles deplete faster than rebuilds rise. A utility consortium releases a tranche of NdPr oxide to keep a wind farm commissioning on schedule. An automaker draws down its buffer to hit a quarter's delivery target. A defense stockpile feeds an actuator line to close a gap in missile production. Each draw buys time. Each draw masks that non-Chinese capacity still trails demand growth. When the tap turns to a drip, the cliff arrives quietly, a reorder that lands 6 months out instead of 2. Quality shifts do as much damage as volume trims. A magnet that technically meets spec rides closer to demagnetization at 160–180 degrees C. Engineers derate to protect field performance. Range estimates shift, duty cycles tighten, cooling budgets grow. A wind turbine's availability model assumes a slightly wider maintenance window. A high-end e-bike app pushes a firmware patch that caps torque under hill climbs to avoid summer motor fade. Customers notice behavior, not metallurgy. The cause sits upstream in a solvent extraction hall you'll never see. Micro story: a Tier 1 motor supplier in Hungary gets a notice. Their allocation stands, but temporary harmonization of coercivity levels will affect 2 months of shipments. Translation: the grains will be a little less resilient at heat. The team huddles. They change varnish, tweak cooling channels, and update the control map to reduce peak current under extended load. The motors ship. A taxi fleet in Athens files more complaints about lag on long hills. The fix works. The brand pays in reviews and a few lost bids. Suppliers adopt queue management tactics that look like airline revenue models. Pay a bit more for predictable slots, a bit more for low-variance lots, a bit more to hold your allocation through holiday shutdowns. This isn't gouging, it's pricing reliability in a system trained for cost first. The companies that can pass those costs to customers do. Those that can't accept slippage, product launches drift, promotions move, cash cycles lengthen. The squeeze compounds through contracts. A most favored clause blocks a buyer from switching to a new entrant who could deliver sooner, but not at the legacy price. A requalification window, 6 months of tests and audits to approve a second magnet source, looks prudent until you need the fallback now. Procurement teams who argued for redundancy find themselves trapped by past savings. The calendar punishes cleverness that ignored physics. Unknown to people far from the factory floor, small trims shift national ledgers. A city transit agency delays an EV bus order into the next fiscal year. Diesel service extends with higher fuel bills. A grid operator keeps a gas peaker online for one more summer because a wind tranche missed its magnet window. Emissions targets wobble. Politicians blame permitting. Engineers point to crates. In allied capitals, anger finds the wrong lever, tariffs that don't move a queue controlled by paperwork and relationships. The actual lever is boring, underwriting redundancy. Defense ministries fund magnet lines near motor plants. Utilities sign 5-year offtakes with non-Chinese magnet makers pegged to uptime, not price alone. Automakers pay assurance cents across millions of units. These moves look expensive in year 1 and cheap when a ship sits offshore in year 3. The last turn of the screw is cultural. Risk managers start writing acceptable slippage memos that normalize delays as a cost of doing business. That mindset is surrender. The alternative is to price reliability openly. Bonuses for plants that never miss, penalties that don't get negotiated away, stockpiles sized to real consumption, not to budget comfort. The squeeze breaks habits or it breaks plans. Here's the part no one wants to say out loud. The Chokepoint doesn't need to shut the door to win. It just needs to keep you waiting, paying, and explaining. A 5% trim, a 2-week hold, a quiet quality shift. Repeat that across quarters and you've moved a country's industrial tempo without firing a shot. The only counter is to buy boredom on your own map and treat it like the product it is. Paying for reliability, markets that reward resilience. If the squeeze is friction, the counter is price signals that buy boring on purpose. Not charity, receipts for uptime. Start with the simplest lever, resilience premiums. An automaker signs a 5-year offtake with a non-Chinese magnet plant. The contract pays a base price plus a steady supply bonus tied to 3 numbers: on-time delivery rate, variance in coercivity at heat, and a hard cap on lot rejections. Hit them, the bonus clears automatically. Miss them, the price ratchets down, and a backup clause lets the buyer pull from a small, pre-qualified reserve. Both sides see the same dashboard. Both sides budget around boredom. Defense can go first because it owns long horizons. A procurement office underwrites a stack NdPr oxide, die and TB metal, alloy strip, and finished magnets across 2 allied clusters. Quantities are modest, but the terms are patient. Ramp premiums in year 1 when yields wander, stepping down as SBC charts tighten, a performance kicker if the plant ships through an extreme weather week without missing a slot, a waste handling transparency requirement with third-party audits that unlock lower-cost debt. The magnet house buys a second furnace with that certainty. The separator across town hires apprentices instead of temps. The risk shifts from survival to improvement. Meanwhile, civilian buyers adopt assurance cents, the way shipping adopted fuel surcharges, small line items that make reliability legible. A wind OEM pays an extra €2 per kilogram for magnets that hold a 98% on-time rate and a coercivity variance under a published band. Over a turbine, it's noise. Over a farm, it keeps a crane schedule intact. Utilities even pool this, creating a buyer's club that offers a predictable demand curve to non-Chinese suppliers in exchange for locked maintenance windows and spare rotor availability. Reliability becomes a product with a SKU. ESG grows teeth when it stops ascribing virtue and starts underwriting practice. Call it ESG2, measurable waste handling and tailings management verified in real time. A separator streams discharge pH, flow, and radioisotope checks to a public portal. A third-party lab audits quarterly and posts results without edits. Buyers who require that verification get a discounted insurance wrapper on their offtakes. Lenders trim interest because tail risk is visible instead of rumored. Cleaner costs more per kilo, but capital costs less per project. The total bill falls because surprises do. Recycling moves from press release to plant when contracts speak its language. Magnet-to-magnet lines sign takebacks with OEMs who design for disassembly. The deals pay a premium for homogeneous scrap, drive units pulled as a unit, marked with alloy codes, coating specs, and hours at temperature. Collection partners get paid on yield, not tonnage. Plants fit hydrogen decrepitation next to sintering and roll reclaimed powder back into production with a traceable tag. A European appliance brand writes this into warranties. Return the old unit, get a credit, and the magnet inside becomes next year's rotor. The plant smooths demand dips with its own scrap. The buyer smooths PR with math. Financial plumbing catches up. Insurers offer throughput cover for new separators, policies that pay when yields fall below a floor in the first 18 months due to process instability, priced down as the plant's variance shrinks. Banks bundle that with debt, lowering spreads. Governments backstop a sliver of the risk for first-of-a-kind lines, not with blank checks, but with step-down guarantees that vanish when SBC stays within bands for 6 consecutive quarters. The message is clear. We'll help you learn. After that, you're on boring. Procurement language changes, and it matters. Specs add 2 lines, verified waste handling and delivery variance. RFPs weight them like cost, not afterthoughts. Lowest bid that misses 2 quarters later loses to second lowest that never misses. Lawyers rewrite penalty clauses so fines for lateness don't get negotiated away in exchange for future discounts. Bonus pools appear for suppliers with perfect years. It's airline logic cleaned up. Pay for your preferred slot, protect your holiday, and don't pretend you can rebook a factory. Micro story: a Midwest motor maker signed twin offtakes, one with an incumbent in China, one with a new ally plant. The ally contract cost 5 cents more per motor and came with a reliability rider, no more than 2 missed weeks a year, coercivity variance under stated line. Year 1, the ally missed twice, paid the penalty, and stayed in the plan. Year 2, a port strike snarled everyone. The ally shipped overland from a nearby separator and hit the window by days. The penalty turned into a bonus. The CFO circled a quiet line on the P&L, crane fees avoided, overtime not paid, launch dates that didn't slip. 5 cents looked cheap. Verification without a circus keeps sign-up high. Satellite imagery scores winter ground cover for upstream mines. Plant sensors stream anonymized process control ranges to auditors. Randomized lot tests at customer sites validate coercivity and impurity bans. No one needs a stranger counting drums on the dock. The rule is simple: show your receipts, earn your rate, hide, and you pay in cash or wait in line. Markets nudge design too. Elevators, robots, scooters, OEMs publish dual-qual badges signaling motors that are validated on 2 magnet sources in different jurisdictions. Retail buyers don't care, fleet buyers do. A procurement officer will pay a small premium for a product that rides 2 queues instead of 1. That premium funds the second qualification before the crunch, not after. All of this works only if someone buys first and forgives well. Defense and grid buyers are built for that. They can anchor magnet lines next to motor houses and commit for 10 years. They can write options for surge production in contingencies. They can force cross-qualification across allies with shared data rooms so a plant in A can pick up A's plan B without 6 months of paperwork. The private sector follows and steals the playbook. There's one last piece: culture in finance. Analysts stop asking why pay more and start asking what did we avoid. Vendor scorecards add a column for missed lots and days late, tracked over years, not quarters. Bonuses in procurement tied to uptime of the supply chain, not pennies shaved today. A magnet that shows up every week is a hedge. A supplier who streams their pond data is a partner. A recycler who hits yield on scrap is a buffer you can bank. Reliability won't trend on a chart. It settles into operations, then into margins that stop wobbling. That's a market, dull, disciplined, priced. If we want out of pending screens and quiet delays, we have to make resilience a line item people get paid to deliver. When boredom pays, the choke point loosens. When it doesn't, the calendar keeps writing our plans for us. The limits, environmental truths, we can't ignore. We've been talking about queues, premiums, and boredom on purpose. None of that matters if the ground and water won't take the load. Rare earths don't break the laws of chemistry or ecology. They cash their checks in tailings, radiation, and water, and the invoice asks a simple question: where, how, and who pays? Start with non-negotiables. Separation throws salts, acids, and solids. Neutralizing those streams makes mountains of gypsum-like cakes that can carry thorium and uranium traces if the ore did. That's not a scare word, it's a monitoring regime. Liners fail, sumps clog, storms overtop ponds. If you site a plant on porous gravel above a shallow aquifer, you aren't unlucky when a well report turns ugly, you're negligent. The baseline is engineered liners, double containment, capture wells that read like a cardiogram, and a closure plan funded on day one, not a promise on page 73. Water is the other hard line. Solvent extraction is thirsty. Washing, scrubbing, rinsing, solvent cleanup, all of it cycles fluid. You can recycle loops, but loops add complexity and points of failure. In drought years, the plant's needs meet a town's taps at the same river. So you publish your draw, build storage that rides heat waves, and flip to night cycles when the grid is strained. No more trust us. Put a dashboard on the town's website and let the mayor read flow like a stock ticker. Now the social license that makes or breaks capacity. Communities don't say no to jobs. They say no to being the catch basin for someone else's margin. The only durable answer is transparency. Real-time discharge pH on a public feed. Quarterly isotopic checks posted without edits. Odor complaints logged, acknowledged, and resolved with timestamps. A community liaison who shows up when pumps fail at 2 a.m. compensation that isn't hush money. Property value guarantees, medical monitoring where radiation is real, and community funds that build more than a company's sign. If you can't do that, you can't build where people live. Guardrails have to go global or the race to the bottom gets a lap lead. If one jurisdiction looks away on tailings, their unit price undercuts everyone who didn't. Buyers need a baseline, no unlined ponds, no dumping into karst, radionuclide controls audited by third parties, waste tracked cradle to closure. Then write it into contracts. Meets baseline or you don't sell to us. It sounds idealistic. It's procurement. Large buyers have used this on forests and fish. They can do it on solvents and sludge. Honest trade is next. Cleaner costs more per kilo. Say that out loud and show the receipt. A magnet that carries a verified waste handling premium of a few dollars per kilogram is not a luxury. It's the price of not moving the pond to someone else's backyard. Governments can help reconcile the ledger. Import standards that recognize verified cleaner output, tariff relief tied to audited baselines, and finance rated to reward plants that stream their data instead of spraying perfume on PDFs. Recycling is not an escape hatch, but it's a pressure release we should scale with humility. Magnet-to-magnet loops save grams and emissions, but they don't erase the need for virgin feed while we're still building fleets and grids. Design for disassembly matters. Screws not glue, coded alloys, standardized housings that come apart without a chisel. Policy can nudge this. Extended producer responsibility that pays more for products that return clean scrap and less for ones that arrive as glued bricks. It's dull work that pays every year after. Some ground shouldn't be mined at all. Thin soils over drinking water recharge zones, zones with faulted geology that turn seepage into springs, basins that already carry legacy contamination. These are no-go even if the grade sparkles. The grown-up answer is to walk away early and concentrate on deposits where hydrology, geology, and logistics stack in your favor. Pay a premium to build a road and a power line to the right ore instead of paving a legal road through the wrong valley. Micro-story, a coastal province weighed a separation plant site near a river bend. The maps looked clean. Then the rainy season turned a 100-year event into a 3-year rhythm. The town's wells spiked turbidity during every storm. The company pushed on. The council got a second opinion. They shifted the site to a plateau with bedrock close and a drainage plan that didn't dump into anyone's backyard. Cost rose 12%. 2 years later, a storm like the first one hit. The plant's ponds held, the town's taps stayed clear, the extra percent looked cheap. There's also the worker ledger. Acid burns, solvent exposure, metal dust. These are not brave badges. They're preventable with ventilation, PPE that fits, medical surveillance, and automation where it reduces exposure. Put the clinic inside the fence. Track exposure like a bank tracks cash. Injury-free bingo doesn't replace a safety culture that pays people to stop a line when a seal weeps. If you can't budget for that, you're budgeting for turnover and lawsuits. Global guardrails don't land without carrots. Create a certification, call it verified midstream, run by boring institutions we already trust for food and pharma audits. Plants that pass get lower cost insurance, better debt terms, and a procurement lane reserved by big buyers. Plants that fail don't get sanctioned into oblivion. They get a punch list and a clock. When they pass, they re-enter at a discount. Fear won't move the map. Math will. We also need to make peace with slower clocks in fragile places. Some ore bodies sit under forests that regulate river basins. Some communities rely on fisheries that don't tolerate sediment spikes. If a project demands temporary damage measured in decades, it's not temporary, it's theft with a euphemism. The exit isn't romantic. It's substitution where it works, efficiency everywhere, and yes, telling the truth about timelines that stretch, because the planet's plumbing doesn't move on your quarterly schedule. Here's the blunt part. Cleaner rare earths will lift a sticker price somewhere. The lift isn't the point. The avoided costs are fewer emergency dredges, fewer clinic bills for chemical burns, fewer unplanned shutdowns when a pond leaks, and regulators rightly bring the hammer. Pay for the guardrails and the receipts get boring. Don't, and the story ends the way these stories always end, with a picture of a brown river and a line of people at a tanker truck. We can live with the truths or pretend they're negotiable. The materials we need are real, the waste is real, and the people under the smokestacks are real. If we want the chokepoint to loosen without moving the harm, we tie our supply to standards that don't blink, and we show our work in public. Cleaner isn't a press release. It's a ledger everyone can read. Decision windows, the next 5 years. The clock isn't abstract anymore. It's procurement cycles, permitting calendars, and apprenticeship cohorts you can count. If you want a midstream that doesn't blink, the next 5 years are the only window where choices still bend the curve, not just soften the landing. Start with the critical path, because sequence will make or break intent. Year 1 is permits and anchor buys. If a separator doesn't have a single permit window with defined service times, a public-facing waste dashboard, and a guaranteed offtake that tolerates a messy first year, it never becomes boring. Put a magnet plant within 1 truck day and a metal shop within the same fence line if you can. Tie them with contracts that pay for on time, on spec, not fantasy pricing. Parallel to that, launch a training pipeline. Operators in solvent extraction labs, vacuum metallurgy apprentices, magnet press techs, drawn from local high schools, trade programs, and veterans pipelines. The bottleneck is people before it's pumps. Year 2 is steel and debugging, not ribbon cutting. Expect crud blooms, budget for solvent reclamation and backup pumps. Cross-qualify reagents and extractants so a supplier hiccup doesn't become a shutdown. This is when defense and grid buyers need to show up with boring money, an extra premium for shipments that hold coercivity at heat during a heat wave, an uptime bonus if the plant ships through a blizzard. Those checks buy muscle memory. Publish SBC charts, not proprietary recipes, just variance bands for delivery timing and coercivity at temperature. Trust survives transparency. Year 3 is magnet-to-magnet recycling co-located with production. Stand-up hydrogen decrepitation, sign take-back contracts with motor reman shops, and force design for disassembly on the next model year motors. Screws, coated alloys, no glue that turns a rotor into trash. Every kilogram pulled from scrap is a kilogram that doesn't wait on a ship. Put a second separator under permit by then, even if demand looks covered. The calendar won't forgive linear thinking when storms, port strikes, or a sanctions spiral arrive. Meanwhile, align procurement language across allies. If the United States, Japan, and a European buyer use the same 2 lines, verified waste handling and delivery variants, and treat them like cost in bids, suppliers can standardize their compliance systems instead of playing 3 different games. Write cross-qualification into the contracts. A magnet tested in A is provisional in B if it stays within bands for 2 quarters, with a short audit instead of a 6-month saga. You're not gambling, you're banking redundancy. Year 4, the metrics need to be public and boring. Count capacity outside China by step. Tons of NdPr oxide at spec, tons of di/Tb metal at spec, tons of strip cast alloy, tons of sintered magnets delivered at stated coercivity bands. Publish time to magnet, ore to oxide, oxide to alloy, alloy to magnet, magnet to motor. Track verified waste handling, discharge pH and flow, radioisotope checks, number of odor complaints logged and closed with timestamps. If these numbers sit in PDFs and not on dashboards, you've built a press office, not a supply chain. Risk clusters won't wait while you organize. A Taiwan flashpoint isn't just a headline, it's a demand spike for precision munitions exactly when commercial EV and wind orders crest. Sanctions ripple into insurance rates, port access, and component queues. Climate shocks add their own rhythm, heat domes that stress magnets at duty, floods that rewrite rail schedules. The only way those don't capsize your calendar is stockpiles sized to consumption, not to a budget comfort number, and a standing surge plan, which lines in which allied plants can run weekends for 90 days, where the magnets come from, how the oxide gets there, and who signs the checks. Choose Your Future sits in front of every board and cabinet. Option 1, keep optimizing to sticker price and pretend queues are someone else's problem. You'll buy spot when it hurts, stretch launches, and normalize acceptable slippage. Option 2, pay reliability premiums now, lock long offtakes with performance riders, demand verified waste handling, and accept that base prices tick up so downtime ticks down. The second option looks expensive in a quarter. It looks cheap over 4 winters. Micro story: a Canadian separator with a European magnet partner took a defense-backed offtake at a premium tied to on-time and coercivity variance. Year 1, they missed twice, paid penalties, and learned. Year 2, a flood hit their region. Their water plan pivoted to night cycles and reuse, shipments held with a 3-day slip. The buyer's crane schedule didn't move. A rival who saved $2 per kilogram at a ward lost 3 weeks at sea. The CFO stopped asking why the premium existed. Set a 5-year scoreboard you can't finesse. Capacity outside China by step with on-spec percentages, not nameplate. Time to magnet for 2 qualified routes, measured quarterly. Verified waste handling rates, discharge pH flow, isotopes, incidents, streamed. Delivery variance, bands for magnets at heat, number of lots rejected for coercivity drift. Recycling capture, kilograms of magnet scrap returned and resintered at spec. People, apprentices trained and retained, number of operators elevated to trainers. If those lines trend steady by year 5, your map holds under pressure. If they wobble, you've built announcements, not resilience. Everything here fights the same reflex that built the Chokepoint: offload risk to the place that priced it too cheaply. The next 5 years either pay for risk where you can see it, permits, plants, people-proof, or they push it forward into a calendar you don't control. The decision isn't can we, it's will we pay for boring in time to matter. The meaning and the move. In the end, the future of technology runs through unglamorous rooms where solvent settles, metal cools, and magnets arrive on time. If you want the real costs behind the energy transition, watch what it takes to make reliability normal. For the deeper story that ties these choices to today's grid and tomorrow's factories, watch the next film and subscribe for the hidden choke points we'll map next.